Hello, this lesson is for the paper 3 subject of crime and deviance, which obviously makes up quite a lot of paper 3. This particular lesson is about globalisation and green crime. So let's get started. First of all, in your booklets you will find a short passage which describes the work of the Conventions on International Trade and Endangered Species. All I want you to do is answer the following questions. Why does the trade exist? What conditions in the countries of origin might facilitate the trade? Why might it be easy to move products out of the countries of origin? Why might the fact that the trade is international make it difficult to suppress? What difficulties might there be in identifying illegal animal or plant products? And why do people buy these products? Let's take a moment to have a read through and to add your answers to those the gaps in your booklet. Okay, well, wasn't such a tricky one to start with. Most of you are probably aware of the fact that endangered species are often hunted for the things that they might offer, whether that's ivory or bones, and that this is a huge industry that usually starts in the developing world where there are fewer restrictions or more difficult to enforce laws or bigger issues to face, but arguably, but their trade expands to the westernised countries, including the UK, where people often buy these as trophies, or sometimes because they believe they contain medicinal qualities or properties. Now, the reason we started with this, because it's a great example of the two things we're going to consider, both globalisation and green crime. So if you flip over your booklet, you'll see that there is a page all about globalisation with that definition, the process by which businesses or other organisations develop international influence or start operating on an international scale. David Held says, the widening, deepening and speeding up of worldwide connectedness in all aspects of life, from the cultural to the criminal, the financial to the spiritual. And of course, we've looked at globalisation in pretty much every topic we've looked at, the impact of it on education, on religion, on even families and households as well. Okay, so it should be no surprise that we would look at the impact of globalisation on crime and how we can relate it to such things. But let's jump straight in with thinking about how globalisation can have an impact. Okay, it can spread new information and communication technologies through ICT. It has really been influenced by and an influence on global mass media. Globalisation has also been a result of and caused cheaper air travel. Okay, the ability to move around the planet. Remember, globalisation is often described as the planet becoming a smaller place. Economically, there has been a deregulation of financial and other markets, and they're opening up to competition as we enter an era where countries deal with other countries on a regular basis. And of course, there is easier movement across country to country, with goods, services and people. So there is easier movement, so businesses can easily relocate to other countries. And of course, the industrialisation process that we saw in the Industrial Revolution has continued, but this time it's moved to more developing and industrialised countries as well. So, how do all these things and the idea of globalisation change crime? Have a think. You've got a box in your booklets for you to make some notes here. So how do you think globalisation may change crime? What opportunities are there for crime to be created? What new types of offences may emerge in a globalised world? And can you think of any types of crimes that are the consequences of globalisation? Okay, so let's have a little bit of think about this. First of all, we can introduce ourselves to our first thinker. Okay, Manuel Castells in 1998 argued that the global economy was worth over £1 trillion a year, and as takes a number of forms, okay? So the criminal economy is actually a colossal part of the world's economy itself. And here are just some of the different types of crimes that are really a part of that criminal global economy. First one, arms trafficking, okay, where weapons are bought and sold usually to illegal regimes, okay, that are running countries usually illegitimately, okay, or maybe as a part of a kind of military junta, but also terrorist groups around the world. The second one is sex tourism, and this is mostly where Westerners, okay, people from the Western Hemisphere, travel to developing world countries usually, but not exclusively, for sex. Sometimes this involves minors. So obviously there are very rigid and strict laws, as well as ideologically dominant ideologies that are completely disdainful of this kind of practice in the Western world, but it's easier for people to are able to commit these crimes in the developing world. Also, trafficking in body parts, organ transplants in rich countries. There's an estimated 2,000 organs taken from condemned or executed criminals in China each year, which might be a form of smuggling that's not necessarily expected, but it's very real and it happens across the Western world from other countries. Something we've mentioned before is cybercrime, okay, such as identity theft, but obviously cybercrimes by their very nature are global because they can take place anywhere, okay, and often it's unknown where the country of origin is that the crime is being committed. We've got green crimes, which we're going to be talking about later in this lesson, things that damage the environment. That could be things like illegal dumping of toxic waste in developing countries, where, again, the same regulatory bodies or the same sort of surveillance system that we have in the UK and in Western world countries doesn't really exist, so companies and corporations feel that they can get away with it. One that you probably had on your list was the drug trade, okay? The drug trade itself is worth $300 to $400 billion per year at street prices. And of course, where drugs are grown, where they're manufactured, and how they get into different countries often relies on various trafficking routes and a complex system of smuggling to get them into countries where, of course, they are illegal to sell and use. Again, another one I'm sure most of you had on your list was international terrorism. We discussed this when we looked at religion and fundamentalism. Often terrorism is based on the ideologies and of fundamentalist groups, but not exclusively. Sometimes these are political organisations. And over the past 25 years, obviously, we've seen major attacks in New York in 2001 and London, the 7/7 bombings, but also, of course, the Manchester and the Manchester Arena bombing, and the in Paris a couple of different occasions at the Charlie Hebdo offices and at the Bataclan. And of course, smuggling, something which may well be exacerbated by globalisation, but is one of those crimes as perhaps as old as time itself. It's movement of legal goods such as alcohol to evade taxes, but also of stolen goods such as cars to sell in foreign markets. And that works, both ways, both smuggling in and out of the UK. So, global crime has a demand side. People in the rich West demand products and services, okay? There is expectations upon a Western life, and that's where the demand for these things happens. But global crime, of course, has a supply side, where the source of the drugs or the sex workers and other goods and services that are demanded for in the West. This can be illustrated by looking at the third world countries, drugs producing countries such as Colombia, okay, Peru and Afghanistan, in which there are large populations of impoverished, what might be described as peasant class people, the underclass, people who are living in extreme poverty, whose only way of maybe finding some sort of source of income is to grow drugs. Drug cultivation is an attractive option. It requires very little investment in technology, and of course it can command a high price when you compare it with traditional crops because of the premium on the fact that it's illegal. So to pick one example, in Colombia there is an estimated 20% of the population of the nation depend on cocaine production for their livelihood. That's a fifth being supported by a drugs trade, an illegal drugs trade. And of course, if we're going to understand drug crime, of course we cannot confine our attention merely to the countries where the drugs are consumed. Globalisation itself has created new insecurities and a new mentality of what we would call risk consequences. And in this situation, risk is seen as global. So, for example, anxieties amongst Western populations about the increased movement of people globally and the need to protect their borders. This is partly a result of moral panics that is created by the media and has led in Western societies sometimes to hate crimes against minorities. One result of this is to toughen up border control regulations, for example, at airports. And it has also led to international cooperation, where there are various wars on drugs, on terror, on crime, illegal migration, and so on. Ian Taylor is a left realist who argues that globalisation has increased inequality. For example, switching manufacturing to low-wage countries, moving industry out of westernised countries over to countries where there are less rigid labour laws, and where things like garments can be mass-produced and very low wages. This itself has produced job insecurity, unemployment, and increased poverty in countries like Britain because work has been removed, industry has disappeared. At the same time, the materialistic culture promoted by global media portrays successful lifestyles in terms of a lifestyle of consumption. The more things that we have, the more stuff we have, can be seen as what is aspirational. And as we've seen before, this has driven the poor to turn to crime. When we studied strain theory, we looked at this idea. The lack of legitimate job opportunities, for example, in Los Angeles, the deindustrialization of a city, of a country as well, has led to the growth of drug gangs, where making money is only achievable through illegitimate means. Globalisation has also created criminal opportunities for wealthy people as well. So the movement of funds around the globe to avoid taxation, employing workers for less than the minimum wage and therefore exploiting them, and also placing workers in breach of health and safety laws, making them work in dangerous environments. Taylor's theory is useful in linking globalisation to the changing patterns in crime. However, it doesn't explain why some people choose to commit crimes and why other people do not. So we're going to look at an example here. I'm going to show you a short video which was all about the collapse of a factory in Bangladesh in 2013. You've got a space in your booklets here to make some notes how we can link Taylor's ideas regarding globalisation, creating increased inequality, and make links to the disaster that happened in 2013.
Widespread protests continue in Bangladesh as the death toll from last week's collapse of an illegally constructed garment factory has topped 370. The collapse of the Rana Plaza complex, where workers made clothes for Western retailers, is considered the deadliest accident in the history of the garment industry. At least 7 have been detained in connection with the incident, including 3 of the building's owners who have been arrested and are expected to face criminal charges. Meanwhile, ongoing rescue efforts were suspended after 9 were freed Sunday morning because a fire broke out in the rubble of the factory, reportedly killing the last survivor of the building collapse. According to the latest numbers, at least 377 mostly young women have been confirmed dead, more than 2,400 have been rescued, while hundreds remain unaccounted for and are feared lost. Police use rubber bullets and tear gas against the thousands of protesters who have taken to the streets, as unrest has spread to several cities. Protesters reportedly set fire to garment factories and cars. More shocking details surrounding the collapse have come to light, further enraging garment workers and their supporters. According to reports, it was known that the illegally built structure was unsafe. Shop workers on the first floor of the building had been evacuated. Garment workers were pressured to stay on the job. The incident has elicited a wide range of responses in the United States. Forbes contributor Tom Worstall writes, "Sadly, Bangladesh simply cannot afford rich world safety and working standards." He says the tragedy, quote, "forces us to face an unpleasant truth. Bangladesh simply isn't rich enough to be able to have the same safety and working standards as those we enjoy in the rich countries." Worstall argues against pushing more regulation and says the only way to improve working conditions in Bangladesh is to boost its economy by buying more goods by workers made there. What Worstall doesn't mention is that Western retailers have rejected calls to fund independent oversight of safety standards at garment factories. They continue to do so even after last November's Tazreen factory disaster that killed over 100 workers, according to the Associated Press. Companies say the measures would be too costly and instead are pushing for increased safety trainings and inspections of factory conditions by private companies. According to the Associated Press, both the Tazreen factory and factories within the Rana Plaza complex passed private inspections before disaster struck. Just a few days before the Rana Plaza collapse, the Real News spoke to Bangladeshi factory workers and their advocates as they toured the United States to pressure Western companies like Walmart to fully fund independent oversight to create safer conditions for workers. Activists held a mock funeral for the victim of the Tazreen factory fire at the apartment of Walmart Board of Directors member Michelle Burns. This is Maritza Silver-Farrell, senior organizer of the Alliance for a Greater New York, speaking to the Real News a few days before the Rana Plaza collapse.
We are having a funeral, a symbolic funeral in name of 112 workers who recently died in a factory in Bangladesh, mainly because of the irresponsibility of Walmart and other companies that supplies from Bangladesh to be able to sell some of those cheap goods in the U.S. So that's why we organize this event, to make sure that their voices are out, that Walmart make changes, and also that the Walmart Board of Directors take action, because they do have the power to make those changes.
Also speaking was Kalpana Akhtar from the Bangladesh Center for Worker Solidarity, who called for Walmart to compensate the families of workers that died in the Tazreen factory fire and for Western retailers to demand increased safety at factories.
Main objectives is to have the compensation for Tazreen workers who lost their life in this fire. So we want these workers has to be compensated by Walmart because they were producing clothes for Walmart. And on the other hand, we are calling this retailer to sign the fire safety MOU, which is very important, that will prevent the future death in Bangladesh.
When citing the importance of Western companies and activists pushing for safer working conditions in Bangladesh, advocates highlight the threats, intimidation, corrupt judicial system, and physical harm workers and organizers face in Bangladesh. Kalpana Akhtar shared her own story.
Wherever we try to support workers' voices, we had to face the criminal charges. The government and the factory owners threw me to prison for a month, and they filed several criminal cases against me, which I'm still facing. And they didn't stop with that. They revoked our organization registration, which not been registered yet. And moreover, they killed my colleague Aminul Islam, and perpetrators are not brought in the book yet. So this is not easy, but we are keep doing this because we believe the consumers, the union folks in this part of the world, they are supporting us and they will be supporting us.
Reporting for The Real News, this is Jessel Noor.
Okay, so quite quite a harrowing story of people losing their life under really harsh circumstances. But hopefully you've been able to make connections there between how globalisation has contributed to that, how there is a connection between obviously the consumption in the West leading to poor working practices in developing world countries, which is then further fueled by a media portrayal of consumerism and aspirational lifestyles. Okay, so yeah, that's quite a while ago now, but I think you'll probably find more recent examples at the same time. Okay, so moving on into other aspects relating to globalisation. There's a handout in your booklets, okay, called Crimes of Globalisation by Rothen Friedrich. The notes are from 2015, okay. As always with this sort of handout, just read through the pages, okay, underline, annotate, make notes, okay, on the different areas that are of interest, and of course where there are case studies and ideas that are useful to us. Okay, so let's move on to look at patterns of criminal organisation to see basically, rather than just the crimes themselves or the reasons for the being committed, talking about how they're able to sustain themselves or organise themselves. Winlow, amongst others, wrote a book called Violence and Governance in the Nighttime Economy, which discusses how globalisation and deindustrialisation have created new criminal opportunities and patterns of crime and deviance at a local level. Okay, and this was done using the case study of bouncers. Okay, so people who work on the doors of pubs and nightclubs in Sunderland in the northeast of England. Okay. So in your booklets, again, there is another article, okay, called How Has Organised Crime Adapted to Globalisation? And if you read that and just make some notes, you'll have some idea of this. Just for reference, we also talked about this study when we were discussing crime and gender as one of the, if you like, the postmodern approaches to looking at how trying to attain different forms of masculinity has, if you like, evolved. Anyway, have a read of the study and again, make some notes, highlight, annotate, underline, have a summary so that when you go back to this to revise, you're not having to reread the entire article. So sticking with patterns of criminal organisation, Hobbs and Dunningham found that the way crime is organised actually is linked to globalisation itself. They found that it involves individuals who work at a local level, for example, dealing drugs, but with a loose-knit network of links which are often international, especially within the drugs trade, of course, in terms of smuggling and manufacturing as well. So this is very different from the kind of more rigid and hierarchical, if you like, mafia style of criminals that we used to see from organised crime in the past. Hobbs and Dunningham argue that today crime works as a kind of glocal system, okay, sort of global and local system, locally based, but with those more global connections. And these systems are loose networks. They're flexible. They're opportunistic criminals who make use of the availability of drugs as abroad. So, like we said, not so rigid. In terms of that kind of more rigid system, Glennie in 2008 examined what he referred to as McMafia, okay? And this was a kind of nickname for the criminal organisations that actually emerged in Russia after the fall of communism and the Iron Curtain in 1989, whereby the former Soviet Union was exposed to globalisation. So following the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union, the new Russian government deregulated a lot of its economy, which led to huge rises in food prices and rent, that kind of hyperinflation. However, commodity prices, things like oil, gas, metals, diamonds, were kept very low. What this opened the door to were very wealthy Russians able to buy these commodities cheaply and then sell them for a huge profit around the world market, what they weren't able to do before. And that created a new Russian elite, which was referred to as the oligarchs, which is a word you may have heard before. So to protect themselves from the increasing disorder that was brought about by the collapse of communism, the oligarchs turned to the new, what were referred to as mafias, which were often composed of ex-state security secret servicemen that were from the old communist state. These were violent organisations who were there to protect these oligarchs, to keep hold of their wealth, and of course had links to other criminal organisations throughout the world. They helped this new Russian wealthy class move their money out of the country and take part in the world economy in a more kind of legitimate way. Now, Glennie traces the origins of transnational organised crime to the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1989. That is his thesis. So you can read more about that in the link here, and I'm just going to show you a video of Glennie talking about the McMafia in a TED Talk.
These are grim economic times, fellow TEDsters, grim economic times indeed. And so I would like to cheer you up with one of the great, albeit largely unknown, commercial success stories of the past 20 years, comparable in its own very peculiar way to the achievements of Microsoft or Google. And it's an industry which has bucked the current recession with equanimity. I refer to organized crime. Now, organized crime has been around for a very long time, I hear you say, and these would be wise words indeed. But in the last 2 decades, it has experienced an unprecedented expansion, now accounting for roughly 15% of the world's GDP. I like to call it the global shadow economy, or McMafia for short. So what triggered this extraordinary growth in cross-border crime? Well, of course, there's globalization, technology, communications, all that stuff, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But first, I would like to take you back to this event. The collapse of communism all across Eastern Europe, a most momentous episode in our post-war history. Now, it's time for full disclosure. This event meant a great deal to me personally. I had started smuggling books across the Iron Curtain to democratic opposition groups in Eastern Europe, like Solidarity in Poland, when I was in my teens. I then started writing about Eastern Europe, and eventually I became the BBC's chief correspondent for the region, which is what I was doing in 1989. And so when 425 million people finally won the right to choose their own governments, I was ecstatic. But I was also a touch worried about some of the nastier things lurking behind the wall. It wasn't long, for example, before ethnic nationalism reared its bloody head in Yugoslavia. And amongst the chaos, amidst the euphoria, it took me a little while to understand that some of the people who had wielded power before 1989 in Eastern Europe continued to do so after the revolutions there. Obviously, there were characters like this. But there were also some more unexpected people who played a critical role in what was going on in Eastern Europe, like this character. Remember these guys? They used to win the gold medals in weightlifting and wrestling every 4 years in the Olympics. And they were the great celebrities of communism with a fabulous lifestyle to go with it. They used to get great apartments in the center of town, casual sex on tap, and they could travel to the West very freely, which was a great luxury at the time. Now, it may come as a surprise, but they played a critical role in the emergence of the market economy in Eastern Europe. Or as I like to call them, they are the midwives of capitalism. Here are some of those same weightlifters after their 1989 makeover. Now, in Bulgaria, this photograph was taken in Bulgaria, when communism collapsed all over Eastern Europe, it wasn't just communism, it was the state that collapsed as well. That means your police force wasn't working, the court system wasn't functioning properly. So what was a businessman in the brave new world of East European capitalism going to do to make sure that his contracts would be honored? Well, he would turn to people who are called rather prosaically by sociologists privatized law enforcement agencies. We prefer to know them as the mafia. And in Bulgaria, the mafia was soon joined with 14,000 people who were sacked from their jobs in the security services between 1989 and 1991. Now, when your state is collapsing, your economy is heading south at a rate of knots, the last people you want coming onto the labour market are 14,000 men and women whose chief skills are surveillance, are smuggling, building underground networks, and killing people. But that's what happened all over Eastern Europe. Now, when I was working in the 1990s, I spent most of the time covering the appalling conflict in Yugoslavia. And I couldn't help notice that the people who were perpetrating the appalling atrocities, the paramilitary organizations, were actually the same people running the organized criminal syndicates. And I came to think that behind the violence lay a sinister criminal enterprise. And so I resolved to travel around the world examining this global criminal underworld by talking to policemen, by talking to victims, by talking to consumers of illicit goods and services, but above all else, by talking to the gangsters themselves. And the Balkans was a fabulous place to start. Why? Well, of course, there was the issue of law and order collapsing, but also, as they say in the retail trade, it's location, location, location. And what I noticed at the beginning of my research, that the Balkans had turned into a vast transit zone for illicit goods and services coming from all over the world. Heroin, cocaine, women being trafficked into prostitution, and precious minerals. And where were they heading? The European Union, which by now was beginning to reap the benefits of globalization, transforming it into the most affluent consumer market in history, eventually comprising some 500 million people. And a significant minority of those 500 million people like to spend some of their leisure time and spare cash sleeping with prostitutes, sticking 50-euro notes up their nose, and employing illegal migrant labor. Now, organized crime in a globalizing world operates in the same way as any other business. It has zones of production, like Afghanistan and Colombia. It has zones of distribution, like Mexico and the Balkans. And then, of course, it has zones of consumption, like the European Union, Japan, and, of course, the United States. The zones of production and distribution tend to lie in the developing world, and they are often threatened by appalling violence and bloodshed. Take Mexico, for example. 6,000 people killed there in the last 18 months as a direct consequence of the cocaine trade. But what about the Democratic Republic of Congo? Since 1998, 5 million people have died there. It's not a conflict you read about much in the newspapers, but it's the biggest conflict on this planet since the Second World War. And why is it? Because mafias from all around the world cooperate with local paramilitaries in order to seize the supplies of the rich mineral resources of the region. In the year 2000, 80% of the world's coltan was sourced to the killing fields of the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, coltan you will find in almost every mobile phone, almost every laptop, and games console. The Congolese warlords were selling this stuff to the mafia in exchange for weapons, and the mafia would then sell it on to Western markets. And it is this Western desire to consume that is the primary driver of international organized crime. Now, let me show you some of my friends in action, caught conveniently on film by the Italian police, and smuggling duty-not-paid cigarettes. Now, cigarettes at the factory gate are very cheap. The European Union then imposes the highest taxes on them in the world, so if you can smuggle them in to the EU, there are very handsome profits to be made. And I want to show you this to demonstrate the type of resources available to these groups. This boat is worth 1 million euros when it's new, and it's the fastest thing on European waters. From 1994, for 7 years, 20 of these boats made the trip across the Adriatic from Montenegro to Italy every single night. And as a consequence of this trade, Britain alone lost $8 billion in revenue. And instead, that money went to underwrite the wars in Yugoslavia and line the pockets of unscrupulous individuals. Now, Italian police, when this trade started, had just 2 boats which could go at the same speed. And this is very important because the only way you can catch these guys is if they run out of gas. Sometimes the gangsters would bring with them women being trafficked into prostitution, and if the police intervened, they would hurl the women into the sea so that the police had to go and save them from drowning rather than chasing the bad guys. So I have shown you this to demonstrate how many boats, how many vessels it takes to catch one of these guys. And the answer is 6 vessels. And remember, 20 of these speedboats were coming across the Adriatic every single night. So what were these guys doing with all the money they were making? Well, this is where we come to globalization. Because that was not just the deregulation of global trade, it was the liberalization of international financial markets. And boy, did that make it easy for the money launderers. The last 2 decades have been the champagne era for dirty lucre. In the 1990s, we saw financial centers around the world competing for their business, and there was simply no effective mechanism to prevent money laundering. And a lot of licit banks were also happy to accept deposits from very dubious sources without questions being asked. But at the heart of this is the offshore banking network. Now, these things are an essential part of the money laundering parade. And if you want to do something about illegal tax evasion and transnational organized crime, money laundering, you have to get rid of them. On a positive note, we at last have someone in the White House who has consistently spoken out against these corrosive entities. And if anyone is concerned about what I believe is the necessity for new legislation, regulation, effective regulation, I say, let's take a look at Bernie Madoff, who's now going to be spending the rest of his life in jail. Bernie Madoff stole $65 billion. That puts him up there on the Olympus of gangsters with the Colombian cartels and the major Russian crime syndicates. But he did this for decades in the very heart of Wall Street, and no regulator picked up on it. So how many other Madoffs are there in Wall Street or in the City of London, fleecing ordinary folk and money laundering? Well, I can tell you, it's quite a few of them. Let me go on to the 101 of international organized crime now, and that is narcotics. Our second marijuana farm photograph for the morning. This one, however, is in central British Columbia, where I photographed it. It's one of the tens of thousands of mum and pup grow-ops in BC, which ensure that over 5% of the province's GDP is accounted for by this trade. Now, I was taken by Inspector Brian Cantera of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to a cavernous warehouse east of Vancouver to see some of the goods which are regularly confiscated by the RCMP from the smugglers who are sending it, of course, down south to the United States, where there is an insatiable market for BC bud, as it's called, in part because it's marketed as organic, which, of course, goes down very well in California. Now, even by the police's admission, this makes not a dent in the profits, really, of the major exporters. Since the beginning of globalization, the global narcotics market has expanded enormously. There has, however, been no concomitant increase in the resources available to police forces. This, however, may all be about to change, because something very strange is going on. The United Nations recognized earlier it was last month actually, that Canada has become a key area of distribution and production of ecstasy and other synthetic drugs. Interestingly, the market share of heroin and cocaine is going down because the pills are getting ever better at reproducing their highs. Now, that is a game changer because it shifts production away from the developing world and into the Western world. And when that happens, it is a trend which is set to overwhelm our policing capacity in the West. The drugs policy, which we've had in place for 40 years, is long overdue for a very serious rethink, in my opinion. Now, the recession. Well, organized crime has already adapted very well to the recession. Not surprising, the most opportunistic industry in the whole world, and it has no rules to its regulatory system, except, of course, it has two business risks: arrest by law enforcement, which is frankly the least of their worries, and competition from other groups, i.e. a bullet in the back of their head. What they've done is they've shifted their operations. People don't smoke as much dope or visit prostitutes quite so frequently during a recession, and so instead they have invaded financial and corporate crime in a big way, but above all, two sectors, and that is counterfeit goods and cybercrime. And it's been terribly successful. I would like to introduce you to Mr. Pringle, or perhaps I should say, more accurately, Senor Pringle. I was introduced to this bit of kit by a Brazilian cybercriminal. We sat in a car on the Avenue Paulista in São Paulo together, hooked it up to my laptop, and within about 5 minutes, he had penetrated the computer security system of a major Brazilian bank. It's really not that difficult. And it's actually much easier because the fascinating thing about cybercrime is that it's not so much the technology. The key to cybercrime is what we call social engineering, or to use the technical term for it, there's one born every minute. You would not believe how easy it is to persuade people to do things with their computers which are objectively not in their interests. And it was very soon when the cybercriminals learned that the quickest way to do this, of course, the quickest way to a person's wallet is through the promise of sex and love. I expect some of you remember the I Love You virus, one of the very great worldwide viruses that came on. Now, I was very fortunate when the I Love You virus came out because the first person I received it from was an ex-girlfriend of mine. Now, she harbored all sorts of sentiments and emotions towards me at the time, but love was not amongst them. And so, as soon as I saw this drop into my inbox, I dispatched it hastily to the recycle bin and spared myself a very nasty infection. So, cybercrime, do watch out for it. One thing we do know that the internet is doing is the internet is assisting these guys. These are mosquitoes who carry the malarial parasite which infests our blood when the mozzie has had a free meal at our expense. Now, artesunate is a very effective drug at destroying the parasite in the early days of infection. But over the past year or so, researchers in Cambodia have discovered that what's happening is the malarial parasite is developing a resistance. And they fear the reason why it's developing a resistance is because Cambodians can't afford the drugs on the commercial market, and so they buy it from the internet. And these pills contain only low doses of the active ingredient, which is why the parasite is beginning to develop a resistance. The reason I say this is because we have to know that organized crime impacts all sorts of areas of our lives. You don't have to sleep with prostitutes or take drugs in order to have a relationship with organized crime. They affect our bank accounts, they affect our communications, our pension funds, they even affect the food that we eat and our governance. This is no longer an issue of Sicilians from Palermo and New York. There's no romance involved with gangsters in the 21st century. This is a mighty industry, and it creates instability and violence wherever it goes. It is a major economic force, and we need to take it very, very seriously. It's been a privilege talking to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so really interesting discussion there and lecture from Glennie all about what he refers to as a McMafia, but that kind of organised crime and exactly how it relates to globalisation and how everybody is really affected by it. So hopefully you got some good notes on that. Just for a point of reference, I should have mentioned before the video, but obviously you probably noticed the caption that said this is 2009. So when you're thinking about some of the things he said regarding the American president, of course, that was Barack Obama at that point, not the current president, okay, to put that into context. Okay, let's move on to discussing green crime, okay. If you, in your booklet, you've got a space here for a definition for green crime, which is basically, very obviously, crimes against the environment, okay. So just take a moment now, have a little think, what sort of crimes could there be against the environment? Well, you might have got some of these, but stick them in your booklets if you haven't. There are things like oil spills, which obviously are polluting our oceans. You've got deforestation of the Amazon, removing acres and acres, hectares and hectares of trees. You've got other oil spills from rigs, not just ships as well, okay? Sometimes this has happened through acts of war and terror, sometimes through freak accidents as well. You've got pollution as well as mining for precious materials and minerals and stones, sometimes done illegally. You've got the sweatshops and child exploitation of workers. That obviously has a human cost, but also has an environmental cost in terms of not only what's being produced, but the manufacturing process itself, which can often contaminate and pollute waters and the air in the environments around it. And then, of course, you've got nuclear disasters. Okay, the biggest, most recent example would be the Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011 in Japan. So let's have a little bit more detail about this. Okay, environmental or green crime can cause huge amounts of damage, not only to the environment, but obviously has an economic cost as well. Okay. There's a newspaper article there reporting on the fact that firms cost 2.2 trillion of environmental damage, which means that someone has to pick up the price of that, not just in terms of the water that we drink and the air that we breathe, but also in terms of paying for these things to be rectified. The Deepwater Horizon disaster by BP, which again was another oil company, cost huge amounts of money to try and repair and undo the damage. Toxic waste spills from corporations, the plastic island, which is as a result of big corporations producing materials that cannot be degraded or break down for many, many years. And then the Bhopal disaster, which was a gas tragedy in the 1980s. You've got a small section, a little summary of this in your booklets. Just have a read and make some notes on the Bhopal disaster. So obviously with green crime, okay, most of the threats to the planet, or the planet's ecosystem rather, are global rather than local, okay? So it's not always that the threat is in a localized small area like Chernobyl was, okay, which obviously covered a huge area, but wasn't necessarily a global issue. And these can be linked to globalisation and the kind of interconnectedness of societies, one thing having an impact on another. Obviously, a lot of the threats to the environment are man-made and not necessarily natural dangers, such as drought, famine and other natural disasters. And as globalisation has increased and technologies have increased as well, the threat of human-made disasters increases. Beck in 1992 argued that in late modern society, massive productivity and technology has resulted in manufactured risks. The most obvious would be, of course, global warming. I'm sure you know all about this. Hopefully it's something you've had plenty of education in the time you've been in education. But of course, greenhouse effect is essential to life on Earth in terms of keeping the planet at the correct temperature. But human-made emissions in our atmosphere are trapping and slowly heating the environment around us. Key greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, chlorofluorocarbons, and water vapour. And while the sun has played a role in past climate changes, and it does happen naturally, the evidence overwhelmingly points to the current warming that cannot be explained by the sun, therefore is likely to be man-made. So we have to ask a question, though, about green crime. The environmental risks that are taken occur without a specific crime being committed. Are these a matter for criminologists? There are two answers to this question, or two approaches to answering this question. One is traditional criminology, where they would argue that this is not concerned with threats to the environment, as they are not officially defined as criminal, because there is no specific or particular law that has been broken. However, traditional criminology is often criticised for accepting official definitions of environmental crimes, which are shaped by the powerful groups that serve their own interests. Okay, so it's unlikely that traditional criminology would see this as a threat, because it's being, if you like, massaged and manipulated by the people who are committing such crimes. Rob White, in 2008, argues that criminology should be concerned with any actions that cause harm, regardless of the law. That should be their interest. And therefore, we have the second, if you like, answer to that question, which would be the response of green criminology, which would say that green crime or crimes against the environment is a form of transgressive criminology, which means that it transgresses or oversteps the boundaries of traditional criminology, and therefore addresses new issues. Okay, so we have, if you like, have to kind of adjust our scope of what we consider to be criminology. Many of the worst environmental harms are not necessarily illegal, and so the subject matter of green crime is much wider than that of traditional criminology. Furthermore, different countries have different laws, so that the same harmful actions that may be a crime in one country might not be in another country. Therefore, legal definitions of environmental harm cannot provide a consistent standard of harm, since they are the product of an individual nation state and their political processes. Okay, what we call this approach is known as semiology, the study of harms rather than specific crimes. So there are two main views when it comes to looking at how we can consider harm. The first one is the anthropocentric view, which makes the assumption that humans have the right to dominate nature for their own ends. Okay, this is the view which is often adopted by transnational corporations. Okay, humans have that kind of autonomous, priority, that anthropocentric view that humans are essentially at the centre of the world in which we live in. The ecocentric view is that environmental harm hurts humans as well, and that capitalism involves the exploitation of the environment as well as its people. Now, this is the view that will be adopted by green criminologists, okay? And I guess this is one of those things where you'd have to make a decision about where you stand, okay? Your own worldview will determine this. So spend some time making some notes on your own perspective on these things, okay? Do you believe that animals have rights? And if so, what rights do you believe animals have? Okay. Does the environment itself have any rights? Is that something that should be looked after beyond just what it can offer us? And do we think that humans, for example, should have more rights than animals or the environment? If so, why do humans deserve to have more rights than an environment or an animal? And what are they? What are those rights? So these are quite philosophical, tricky, moral questions. They'll be determined a lot by your own outlook, the reading you've done, the upbringing you've had, okay? But it's interesting that to consider those, because those are exactly the sort of questions that people have to consider to understand things like green crime. Now, green crime itself can be defined into two different types. There's primary crimes and secondary crimes. So let's look at these one by one. Primary crimes are those that result directly from the destruction and the degradations of the Earth's resources. South in 2014 identified 4 main types of primary green crimes. 1, crimes of air pollution. 2, crimes of deforestation. 3, crimes of species decline and also animal rights. And 4, crimes of water pollution. So you can spend some time now doing some research and finding examples, at least one example of each type of these primary green crimes. Well, I'm sure it wasn't too tricky to find examples of those, which might be kind of unfortunate, but there's plenty of them. Let's move on to looking at secondary green crimes, okay? And these are crimes that occur when rules that are aimed at preventing environmental disasters are broken, bent, flouted, okay? So again, South identifies 2 types of secondary green crime. The first one would be state violence against oppositional groups. Okay, so this is where perhaps a government or officials will actually actively try and deter those who are trying to protect the environment. The most famous example would be in 1985 when the French Secret Service blew up the Greenpeace ship, the Rainbow Warrior, in Auckland, just off New Zealand, to prevent it from protesting the French nuclear tests that were going on in the Pacific Ocean. And that made a lot of news stories and got a lot of coverage and really probably gave Greenpeace, the environmental organisation, a lot of press coverage. The second type of secondary crime, green crime, that South identifies is hazardous waste and organised crime. So, for example, the legal disposal of toxic industrial waste is very expensive. So some businesses may dispose of it by using eco-mafias who profit from illegal dumping. They ask other people to sort this out for them. Good example of this was when more than 28,000 rusting barrels of radioactive waste that lie off the seabed of the Channel Islands, reportedly dumped by the UK authorities in the 1950s. Illegal waste dumping is often globalised. Western businesses ship their waste for processing in the developing world countries where costs are lower and safety standards are sometimes non-existent. Roscoff in 1998 claims that the cost of legitimately disposing of toxic waste in the USA is about $2,500 a tonne, but some third world countries will dispose of it for as little as $3 a tonne. So the incentives of disposing of something safely, ethically, and in a way that doesn't damage the environment are tiny compared to the advantages to a corporation at giving this to an illegal operation that will deal with it much more cheaply. So, can you think of some of the critiques of the content that we've covered throughout this session? Make a note of them and then listen to some of the ideas that we've got. So let's have a look at some of the sort of strengths, if you like, the advantages of considering green crime, particularly green criminology. It recognises the importance of environmental issues. These are an adaptation to the law, whereas previously it wasn't considered as important as it is now, and that reflects changing ideologies in society. A weakness of green criminology, though, is that it focuses on that broader concept of harm rather than legally defined crime, which makes it difficult to define the boundaries of its field of study clearly. Defining these boundaries often involves making value judgments rather than kind of more pragmatic sort of scientific decisions. So when we're talking about what's right and wrong, that might be a lot more subjective than it is objective. Okay, so there we go. That is the stuff that you need to do to fill in the booklet from this presentation. However, in your booklet, you have got a few articles, okay, that will consolidate the stuff that we've studied here. Make sure you are relating those to both globalisation as well as green crime. Okay, the two obviously work hand in hand. You've also got a number of activities to fill in and summarise the information here, a mind map, a collection of boxes. Okay, all of this stuff is really good consolidation to make sure you know the stuff that you need to know ahead of the exam. Okay, and of course, any questions that you've got, there's one at the back of the booklet as well, with a 30-mark question with an item for you to make a plan on, with a little bit of examiner's advice as well. So plenty of consolidation activities. Okay, but remember, you can always go back and watch parts of the video if you need more information. So thanks very much for watching. Okay, get the booklet filled in, and we're one step closer to completing our units on crime and deviance.